And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello out there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of BOA Audio, Season 3. Our guest is Greg Reece, author of UFO Religion, Inside Flying Saucer Cults and Culture. I'm especially excited to bring Greg on the program because this interview was one of the very first, if not the very first, interview that Greg did on UFO religion. So I'm really psyched to be introducing him to the BOA Audio listening audience. He is a fresh voice to the field of ufology, an outsider with a tremendous scholarly background, who is looking at elements of the UFO world that a lot of people haven't really taken a look at. In this interview, we're going to be talking about belief systems associated with the UFO phenomenon, the contactee movement, UFO cults, and how UFO revelations may affect Christianity. Additionally, we'll be talking about the ancient astronaut theory, new gods versus old gods, fear as the driving force behind ufology, and of course, tons and tons more. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Greg Reece, let me give you a little bit of background on him. Gregory L. Reece holds a Ph.D. in religious studies from the Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California. He is also a graduate of the Vanderbilt Divinity School, Samford University, and Martin Methodist College. He is the author of UFO Religion, Inside Flying Saucer Cults and Culture, and Elvis Religion, The Cult of the King, one of the top 5 pop music books of 2006, according to the Sunday Times of London. He's also the author of Irony and Religious Belief, an interpretation of the theories of religion of Soren Kierkegaard, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Richard Rorty. His research and publishing interests include philosophy of religion and the study of new religious movements. Dr. Reece is a freelance writer who resides in Montevallo, Alabama. He is currently working on a book entitled Weird Science and Bizarre Beliefs, Mysterious Creatures, Lost Worlds, and Amazing Inventions. His website is www.uforeligion.com. Check it out. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on October 2nd, 2007. Greg Reece talking about UFO Religion, Inside Flying Saucer Cults and Culture on BOA Audio, Season 3. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio. This week we have a very special guest. He is the author of the book UFO Religion, Inside Flying Saucer Cults and Culture. He is Greg Reece. That's his book. It's a fantastic book. I just finished it yesterday. It's very interesting. It takes a real interesting look at some of the groups and organizations, if you will, that spring up centered around the UFO phenomenon, why they come about, and what they're all about. It's sort of a real interesting look at the people as opposed to the phenomenon, and that's really obviously what we're really interested in here on BOA Audio is the people, not so much the phenomenon. So it's a great book in that regard, and I'm excited to bring him here on the show. Greg Reece, welcome to Binnall of America Audio.
Hey, it's wonderful to be here tonight. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Awesome. For starters, tell people a little bit about you, your bio, your background, where you came from, what your work was like, and how you got interested in the paranormal phenomenon UFO subject.
Sure. My official training is in philosophy of religion, and I have a Ph.D. in philosophy of religion from Claremont Graduate School out in Southern California, and am trained in the what we call the Wittgensteinian analysis of religious belief. And unlike most of my the fellows in my field, I'm far more interested in new and esoteric religious movements than I am in the classical religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so what I've attempted to do with this book is to apply some of my my training in the study of mainstream religion to this far more interesting and rapidly developing thing that we call, esoterica, the UFO religion. I am a resident of Montevallo, Alabama, where I'm an independent scholar, full-time writer, and have had an interest in flying saucers ever since I was a kid. I think my first memory is of the Falkville, Alabama sighting, which happened, I guess, maybe back in 1973 or something like that, in which Sheriff Greenhaw, the sheriff of Falkville, photographed a little alien creature in tinfoil, or so it appeared in the photographs, and made the local news. He was a sort of a big celebrity in North Alabama, where I was from, and haven't been able to shake that all of my life, even though I've pursued higher education and learned all the things that are supposed to be real and supposed to be true. Haven't been able to shake the psychological impact that grainy photograph had on me as a child. I think it awoke a sense of wonder in me that maybe there's more to life than I've been taught by my parents and by the society that I know.
Mm-hmm. And then you sort of came into this from the description. You have a great story about going to the UFO Congress I think it's in Laughlin, Nevada. But you sort of came into this as an outsider tackling the UFO subject. Talk a little bit about, I guess, sort of just how you even started looking into the UFO phenomenon for the book, at least.
Right. Yeah, I was, as I said, I was very interested in, as someone who's not a true believer, in the sense that I don't come to the table with any personal experiences of UFO encounters or any sort of paranormal experience. I don't come with any belief or attitudes about the subject, other than someone who's very interested in the phenomena itself. And so one of the things I've tried real hard to do in the book is to approach the subject as an outsider, but not as a skeptical outsider. Mm-hmm. I'm not so much interested in poking fun at people, or in which a lot of people do in this field, and I'm not interested in being a skeptic. I mean, I'm not. This is not the Skeptic magazine approach in which I try to debunk all of the beliefs that I encounter. I'm really interested in them. I find them compelling, even if they're not compelling to me personally to accept as true. They're compelling in that they illustrate wonderful human dramas and wonderful personalities. So one of the first things I did was to go out to Laughlin, Nevada for the UFO Congress a couple of years ago. And one of the great things about that group is that pretty much the entire spectrum of ufology is represented there. Yeah. The nuts and bolts guys were there. The abductee proponents were there. And then there were some people who were regularly reporting transmissions from extraterrestrial governments, and sort of looking very much like the old, 1950s contactee movement. And that meeting out in Laughlin every year is vibrant for that reason, because you have all these different approaches to it. And I tried to approach it as an outsider, but someone who had a real interest. One of the neat things I did was to go out on a sky watch. There was an informal group of people who wanted to leave the confines of the casino, if you can imagine wanting to do that. And we went out in the Mojave. It was pitch dark. I had no idea who anyone was, and couldn't even see the faces of the people that I met there. It was kind of a strange experience in that sense, that I was out in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of people not only I did not know who they were, I didn't even know what they looked like, because it was so dark. Yeah. And we spread a blanket on the ground, and we sat around in a circle, and a couple of people brought some didgeridoos, and they played, and we didn't have a sighting, but I was really moved by my encounter with those faceless and nameless protagonists out in the desert, who told their stories of their encounters. One woman recounted the fact that she had been in Washington, D.C., and I believe was it 1952 when the classic sightings happened in D.C. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I talked with someone who who reported having extraterrestrial visitors in her bedroom at night. So you have someone who had this, encounter seen by hundreds, if not thousands, of people, of lights in the sky, and then someone who had a very intimate encounter with something she couldn't explain in her own bedroom. And these people weren't. They didn't strike me as being nutty. They didn't strike me as being stupid. They struck me as being sincere and intelligent people. And even though I wasn't compelled to accept, the answer that they had found, that they're extraterrestrials visiting the Earth, I was intrigued by these human beings that I encountered there.
And you sort of touch on one of the big sticking points in ufology, and of course that's like that nuts and bolts versus what you call in the book is what they call actually the lunatic fringe. Your book, it does a pretty good job of sort of looking at both sides, and you explain very well in the introduction that you have to look at the nuts and bolts before you can get to what they call the lunatic fringe, or people that take the UFO influence and really run with it, if you will, and turn it into something else. I guess for starters, just sort of talk about that nuts and bolts versus lunatic fringe schism, I guess you could say, that started sort of in ufology in the 50s and has gone on for a long time.
Well, sure. The very early on in ufology, you had two. I don't know if they were competing camps, but two opposing camps. Some who insisted that what we are dealing with are physical phenomena, which must have some sort of physical explanation. People who brought a scientific background primarily to the study of unidentified flying objects. Very often they call themselves, and were called by others, nuts and bolts ufologists, because of their belief that finally what we're looking at here is something that can be reduced to nuts and bolts. It can be reduced to machinery. It can be reduced to something that is physical. We're talking about physical visitors from another planet, another galaxy, flying in physical craft, which may be far beyond anything we can imagine, but is nevertheless subject to the laws of physics and subject to the physical world that we all inhabit. It may look to observers from primitive Earth as if these beings are supernatural, but we only assume that is because they are so far in advance of us technologically. Yeah. I believe it was Arthur C. Clarke who said the technology of an advanced civilization is bound to look like magic to primitives. And so we're the primitives, and this great technology may look like magic to us, but finally it is a physical occurrence. Now, as much, I think, as the nuts and bolts people tried hard to insist that they were pursuing science and that ufology could and should be a science, there was from the very beginning, maybe even prior to the nuts and bolts folks, a strong theme of spirituality in the ufological community. This arises in some parts out of theosophy, in some parts out of the Shaver mystery and Ray Palmer's work. And so that you have people who began to make claims. One of the earliest and most famous, no doubt, is George Adamski, who said, "Okay, these are physical beings on a physical craft, but they're coming and they're giving us a spiritual truth. This is not primarily a scientific matter. UFOs are primarily a religious phenomena. The beings on board the craft are coming with messages, in Adamski's case, warnings of possible nuclear disaster, of examples of how we might seek out and find world peace." These distinctions get murky, however, as time progressed. And so that by the time you have, for example, the 1970s, 80s, and then in the 90s, the abductee movement in ufology, where people are beginning to make the claim that they've been abducted by extraterrestrial beings. There you see this sort of mixture of the two approaches to ufology and coming together there. So you have the claim that these are physical beings from another planet coming to do physical experiments on human beings, and yet very often the context is a religious context. Yeah. I mean, when you're awakened in the middle of the night by a vision, you can't help but think of that in religious terms, even if it is a physical being that is awakening you. And the kinds of stories that people told about coming back from the experiences of abduction, having their lives transformed, no longer able to think in the way that they used to think, being aware, even if they couldn't directly remember the event, but being aware that something significant had happened in their lives is very akin to the way people describe religious experiences and religious conversions.
Yeah.
And so even though the two areas are still distinct and sometimes still warring with one another, there's a great deal of overlap. And one of the things I try to do in my book is make the distinctions between the two approaches to the subject, but also show how you can't really have one without the other. That there is a great deal of nuts and bolts ufology that must be understood in order to get to the point where you can have spiritual experiences with extraterrestrials. And there is likewise a certain mystical element even to the most scientific approach to flying saucer studies.
Yeah. And one of the points you raise in the book that I thought was really interesting is that even though the nuts and bolts folks, they're kind of, they're down on the other side in the spiritual aspect, and they call them the lunatic fringe and everything, there is sort of a built-in belief structure, if you will, within that sort of nuts and bolts ufology. And we've seen that a lot in recent years with the ongoing debate about the extraterrestrial hypothesis. That seems to be one of the big foundations of the UFO world. And that's a belief structure, because obviously we don't know if there's ETs piloting these things, but it seems like since the 50s or so, that's been the source, I guess you could say, for UFOs. And other aspects of the belief structures, such as, government cover-up, like that sort of thing. I guess talk a little bit about how, even though the nuts and bolts people, they're really interested in science, in the nuts and bolts aspect of ufology, there is a belief structure. And I guess you could say it's not necessarily like a religion, but in a way it sort of is.
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's no mystery that nuts and bolts ufology has not been accepted within the world of mainstream science. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason for that is that you do have a competing belief structure, so that nuts and bolts ufology doesn't share the belief structure and the entire belief structure that mainstream science has. And that the difference between the two is one of the things that have kept them clearly apart and somewhat at war for the last 50 years. But right, even in nuts and bolts ufology, then you have a belief structure, some of which borders on supernaturalism. I mean, the idea that the federal government could be so omniscient and omnipowerful that it could keep all of this under wraps for 50 years.
Yeah.
That the idea that the federal government has this power over human beings is kind of a religious structure. I mean, there is an omniscient being in nuts and bolts ufology very often, and that is the government, at least among the conspiracy buffs. Mm-hmm. And and that element of mystery that is normally associated with the ineffable deity is often applied within conspiracy theories to the government, or if not the government, at least to some secret government organization within the government, so that you have, for example, the men in black, who represent this near mystical power that the government has. These are, I suppose you'd say, these are like dark angels that visit UFO witnesses on behalf of the sinister power of the government. And they have great power. They can they appear suddenly and disappear. They have the ability to threaten one's life, so that to the point that you believe what they say and refuse to talk about what you've seen. And they operate in such a near mystical fashion, so that you actually have this tradition of men in black, of black-robed figures, going back even into ancient mythology, in which these are often messengers of doom or of dark powers. And so even though people might say we're dealing with purely physical phenomena here, these men in black are physical people who are representatives of a physical government. Nevertheless, it has taken on a kind of religious aura I was always been struck by the difference, say, between Kehoe and Edwards, who are kind of a couple of the classic nuts and bolts folks,
mm-hmm.
and Hynek, who's also of that same persuasion. But there are differences in their attitudes toward the government. Edwards and Kehoe, I think, wanted to believe that the government was this all-powerful thing that knew the answers, while Hynek, having worked for the government in UFO research, approached the subject by saying, "Look, the problem is the government doesn't know what's happening. They're not as bright as you might think they are."
Yeah.
I tend to be of that school myself. I mean, one of the things that I find incredible about claims about government conspiracies is that the government could be that powerful and that good, when the only evidence I have of the way the government acts is that it appears to be rather weak and simple-minded, and if it's diabolical, it's diabolical despite itself, not because it's got some evil plan, but because it doesn't see things as clearly as it ought to. So that idea that the government is this pervasive evil force is itself, I think, a kind of religious belief.
Yeah. And that's the tough thing, I guess, about the UFO phenomenon, is that the people who investigate it, because it's such a mystery, they bring their own sort of baggage with them, and that colors their interpretation of the mystery.
Well, yeah, I think that's true of everybody, and that's true of the human condition, that whenever we approach a subject, we bring a great deal of ourselves to it. But you're right, because the UFO mystery is a mystery, because we haven't been able to get our hands on any of those nuts and bolts yet. At least we haven't been able to get our hands on them so that the mainstream society knows of it and can study it. It's a lot easier to bring our backgrounds and our presumptions to the table, so that you clearly see this with people like Adamski, and who was so trained in theosophy. And when the UFO movement broke on the scene, and when Arnold had the sighting, and people began to talk about flying saucers and people from other planets, it was so easy to see how Adamski could locate all of his theosophical notions within the world of ufology. So instead of mystics from Tibet communicating with someone to tell them the truths of creation, he has mystics from Venus communicating with him about the truths of creation. But that's true, I think, across the board. We all bring as much as I try not to in my book, we all bring our assumptions to the table. I mean, what I bring is probably my skeptical, ironic, early 21st century kind of distance from everything.
Yeah.
That's what I bring to the table when I approach the subject, and that's probably what you end up with when you read the book, is that this is written by a dilettante, someone who just wants to drop in and see what's going on in this conversation, even though I don't really have anything big at stake in it. And so probably I've missed some things because of that. Hopefully it also means, though, that I've brought some things to the table that a devoted believer might not bring, or that a diehard skeptic who is just out to prove how foolish all of this is wouldn't be able to bring to the table.
One of the things you came out pretty hard against in the book was not necessarily against the actual idea, but just against the way it's being handled, I guess you could say. That would be the abduction phenomenon, and then sort of the little side road that has gone down now, and that's the reproductive agenda, the hybrid situation. And you seem really anti the way it's being handled, because the people who are coming to these conclusions via hypnosis and all that stuff, they can't really provide any help for these people. They're confirming their worst fears and then sending them on the way. They're not really helping them very much. Talk a little bit about your thoughts on the whole reproductive agenda, the hybrid situation, and maybe how you feel that's being handled.
Sure. Yeah, I admit, sometimes even objective observers get their emotions and their points of view wrapped up in things. And one of the things that I guess I do find to be somewhat abhorrent are the claims associated with some of the claims associated with the abduction phenomena and with the idea of the reproductive agenda. simply because I find it so disturbing that you obviously have individuals, mostly women, in terms of the reproductive agenda, who are experiencing traumatic events in their lives. And I just don't know that it's the healthiest thing for relatively, how do I say this tactfully, people who are relatively unsophisticated and unschooled. That's not tactful at all. But people who are unsophisticated and unschooled in the field of mental health, bringing things to the table for these women that might actually cause them greater psychological and personal emotional harm than it would help. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about the abduction phenomenon and the idea that, for example, that a woman may be impregnated with a hybrid child only to have the child or the fetus removed from the womb and then later shown to the woman as a child on an alien spacecraft. I mean, one of the assumptions I would make is that we're dealing here with a woman who, perhaps at least in our normal everyday parlance, has experienced a miscarriage. She's lost a pregnancy. Mm-hmm. That's, I would assume, in these cases, is a fact for most of the people involved who make that claim. I just sort of trust that they're actually telling the truth here, that they were pregnant and then they weren't pregnant anymore. Yeah. And there's a tragedy involved in that, a personal tragedy for individual lives, for individual women, individual families. But then we take the step from that to the hypothesis that because of certain repressed memories that one has, or certain dreams one has, or certain vibrant waking memories that one has, we can assume that what has happened is the fetus has been removed by extraterrestrials and is being raised on a spacecraft without love and kindness and human emotion and human touch and comfort. That leap is a pretty big leap. We're dealing with a fact. A woman has had a miscarriage, has lost a pregnancy. Even with the best evidence we could muster at this point, I think we'd have to say that the idea that extraterrestrials are responsible for this is a hypothesis. Yeah. Not yet a theory. We don't have proof yet even to make that a theory. It's a hypothesis. Whether it's true or false, I want to put that on the shelf. Because we don't know the final answer to that. So it seems that when you approach these women who have a real life crisis and then you give them a hypothesis which is so lacking in evidence but which has such potentially disastrous emotional connotations for them, I find that a little disturbing. I also find that, to be on my soapbox for a moment, that 60-year-old men talking about children or young people being forced to have sex with extraterrestrials or being forced to have sex with other people, it all starts to sound rather creepy to me. And that's the kind of thing, all right, if it's true and you have evidence for it, we can certainly talk about it and put it on the table. And we need to talk about it. But as long as the evidence is shadowy, as it is in the UFO mystery, maybe we shouldn't be so bold in our proclamations about the truth of it. Yeah. Because it does sound creepy sometimes, a lot of the time. As if we're so concerned about, our sexuality that we're worried that aliens are going to come in the middle of the night, and I think I say in the book, and stick things in our Yahoos and do something to us. It's a philosophy, an approach that limits human capability. It makes humans victims in the story. And if there's one part of the UFO story that I don't like, it's the part where humans are victims. That's a disturbing story, and I'm not sure we have evidence for that. Yeah. I'm not sure we are the victims in this tale just yet.
And then to sort of move into the next sort of part of the book, I guess you could say, and this is the contactee movement and sort of going from the nuts and bolts folks to the lunatic fringe, if you will. And I hasten to use that expression, but it's the easiest way to clarify between the two groups. So forgive me to all the lunatics listening. And I guess the question I first wanted to ask is, because you really describe in great detail and really well in the book sort of the spectrum of contactees, from people who are abducted and just sort of get a message, to your classic contactees who, are out spreading the message, to then it gets into some serious heady stuff with cults and serious groups and that kind of thing. Just as a sort of leaping off point, I guess the question to start out would be, what makes a contactee go from a one-person experiencer to a cult leader? How does this happen?
Well, that is a great mystery. What turns a contactee, a devout religious believer, into the leader of even if we don't want to call them cult, but into a leader of a religious culture, a religious community? What makes the distinction? And that's very complicated. It has a lot to do with, of course, the individual person involved, how persuasive they can be, how charismatic they are, how intent they are on spreading their message. It also has a lot to do with, of course, the people that they encounter, the people that come within their circle. And then it has a lot to do with the culture as a whole. Very often these close-knit religious communities, cults, are serving some need in the community, at least a need that a minority has. And if the right person arrives at the right time, John the Baptist wandering in the wilderness becomes Jesus with, a whole group of followers behind him. And what makes that distinction? How does one go from being a contactee to a cult leader? It's hard to say. For me, though, however, one of the things that I like to note is that it's very important that the world of ufology maintain a sense of humor.
Yeah.
That we take all of this as serious as it needs to be taken when it needs to be taken that way, but that we also are willing to notice and appreciate the absurdity of the situation. Mm-hmm. That people who are making claims about UFOs and extraterrestrials are making claims that the majority of people are going to find a little bit odd. And these beliefs, UFO beliefs, have been expressed in a lot of odd ways. So, one of the things then that I find interesting about the distinction between someone like Truman Bethurum, who was an early or mid-1950s contactee, and say someone like Rael of the Raelians, is, for all you could say about Truman, Truman was a little wacky and a little funny. And I like to give people enough credit to think that he was a little wacky and a little funny, not just because he wasn't very bright or he wasn't very sophisticated, but because he knew he was a little odd and a little funny.
Yeah.
I think he appreciated the jokes, the Admiral Scow spacecraft coming down, and the Captain Aura Rames wearing a cute miniskirt and a fashionable beret. Was he sincere when he was talking about that? I assume he probably was. Did he also notice that was a little strange? Surely he did. And that ability to laugh, I think, is one of the things that allows human beings to step back and to keep from crossing that line to the point of utmost seriousness, so that you end up with a belief structure that is so firm and so fixed, and that one is so sincere about it that you couldn't laugh and you couldn't question it. And down that road leads danger, I think.
Yeah.
It leads to a kind of religious belief that stifles creativity and stifles the human spirit and gets us into acts of terrorism and acts of war and all those all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So I think it's critical, and I think that's one of the distinctions is the ability to take some of this with a grain of salt. And there's a long tradition of that within ufology. I mean, think of, Gray Barker as one of my personal heroes of the whole story. He puts a fishbowl on his head. It's a funny thing. He goes on TV, wearing a space helmet. He's a funny guy. Does he bring lots of serious insight into the phenomena? I think he does. But he does it in such a way that we know that he was a child at heart.
Yeah.
And there's part of the UFO phenomenon that speaks to that, the child in us. And maybe that's just because I was a child when I first encountered these ideas. But there's something exciting and thrilling about the idea of green-skinned Martians in tiny little spacecraft coming down to planet Earth. And whether they bring good tidings or mysteries, that's an exciting, life-affirming image. When you leave that humor and childishness completely out of the picture, you end up with aliens as sexual predators and extraterrestrials bent on the destruction of humankind and sinister plots. And while, to be honest, I have no belief in either little green Martians coming down and landing in my lawn, and no personal belief in intergalactic governmental conspiracies, as an outsider to both of those worlds, I find one more appealing than the other, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I can see why a sinister government conspiracy or intergalactic conspiracy would be less appealing. Now, all these different groups, I guess the cynical point of view of a lot of people is that they're hoaxers or they're in it for the money, and a lot of people seem to think that might be a motivating factor. In the vast array of groups and everything like that, how many would you say were genuinely, I guess you could say, believers, and how many you think were hoaxers or just charismatic people that were duping people into joining along in their little gang?
That is another one of the mysteries that makes this field so fascinating to me. I have a heck of a time telling the difference between hoaxers and true believers.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of people do. I think that's one of the problems inherent in the field. So I don't know that I would even make the dichotomy like that, to say that either people are true believers or they're hoaxers. I get the feeling that there are some people who are true believers who are led to fabricating evidence, we might say, in order to help their cause, without any malicious intent. I mean, were the people in the Middle Ages who advertised that their church had a splinter of the cross of Jesus, were they hucksters out to make a buck, or did they authentically believe in that? Somewhere in the middle, I would imagine. Right? I mean, surely religious belief being what it was in the Middle Ages, pure hucksterism wasn't as prevalent as it might be today. People actually believed in things. Almost everybody believed in God. So to claim you had a splinter of the cross of Christ was a significant claim for practically everyone. Was there a little voice in the back of someone's head saying, but, if we had all the splinters of the cross of Christ that are scattered around Europe, we would be able to build, the Tower of Babel because there's so many of them? Sure, I think it was there. And, I mean, I don't want to accuse anyone in particular of forgery, but I have to think that, especially in the realm of the contactees, where you have some of these people who have such strong personal religious beliefs about the message the extraterrestrials are bringing, and then when asked to give proof for that, maybe it's not too incredible to think that they might be able to generate photographs as proof for their spiritual message and not feel that they're doing anything wrong about it. So I like to see the good in even hoaxers.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer or that makes you happy or not, but I think that's right. That in hoaxing is a reputable art in the world of religion, and that's just the way it is. I mean, you don't want to be found out, but everybody does it.
So you think it's more of the hoaxing is to go along to reinforce the belief structures, not so much like that they're just sitting there one day and they're like, I'm kind of running out of money here. Maybe I should start my own little group, say that I got contacted by an ET or something like that. So you're saying is it's more like if there's hoaxing going on, it's to reinforce the belief structure, not as the hoax is to generate the belief structure.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are some people who have made claims about paranormal experiences that are purely hoaxers, and they're in it for the money. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I don't want to make a blanket statement that everybody is sincere. There are lots of people who are in it for the money. There are also people who are in it for the laugh. I mean, it's kind of funny to throw a pie plate in the air and take a picture and see it show up on the internet or in a newspaper. But I think in those instances when we're dealing with people with long-term kind of connections to the movement, I find it harder there to think that they are just hoaxing. There are more profitable ways to make a living than chasing flying saucers or trying to sell books about flying saucers. Trust me on this one. Yeah. There are many more profitable ways to make a living than doing that. That's one of the mysteries of human nature, I suppose. You have to decide those things on a case-by-case basis. If you pressed me over a beer, not in this context, but over a beer, I would tell you who I think the hoaxers are. But I don't necessarily mean that as an insult to them. It's fine, that they were hoaxing. That's part of the game. And if the UFO community is smart enough to figure them out, that's fine too. If not, they contribute something to the mythology.
Exactly, yeah. It's the UFO people's responsibility to weed out that sort of thing.
Sure.
The contactee movement really sort of exploded in like the 50s, 60s, maybe a little off on the timeline, but the gist of the question I have is why does that movement seem to have sort of fizzled out in the last like 10, 15, 20 years? We really don't see the contactees as sort of like a nostalgia thing now more than a viable element in ufology. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an adequate answer for you, but part of it, I suppose, is that the 1950s and 60s were, with the Cold War being so important in the lives of people, the idea of extraterrestrial saviors could be, a lot more persuasive than it might be now. But I would go on to say that I guess I would challenge some of the assumption that it's the contactee movement has gone away. For whatever reason, contactees aren't receiving the publicity. They aren't writing the books and setting the public agenda anymore. And part of that is just, I think, a quirk of history, that because of some of the things that happened and some of the emphasis that was placed in the 90s, primarily on Roswell and on the abduction phenomena, that emphasis, the spotlight finally moved away from them. Yeah. But I've met lots of people who've had contacts with extraterrestrials and have messages from extraterrestrials. They just aren't getting the media attention that they were getting in the 1950s and 60s. And I think the story is largely related to that, the big movement in the 1990s with Roswell and the abduction phenomenon and the Sci-Fi Channel documentaries and the Discovery Channel, and all of this emphasis placed by those forces placed on the more nuts and bolts side of the picture. Maybe that story was just more compelling for a while.
Yeah,
I would think so, and my guess is that the pure contactees from the 1950s aren't gone forever, and that there will be, from what I've seen, sort of on the undercurrents of ufology, is there an awful lot of people who may not have names that are recognized within the UFO community, but there are an awful lot of people who I would describe as contactees out there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they've found the voice right now.
Yeah.
But I anticipate they just might. It seems that with the interesting and sometimes terrifying set of circumstances that have come upon the world in the last 10 years, it seems that things might be ripe again for the voices crying in the wilderness that we need to straighten up and love one another, or the world is going to come to a rather tragic end. We might see more of that in coming days.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what develops on that front. One of the interesting points you make when you're talking about the different groups that have sort of a UFO context to them as far as religious groups You talk about Scientology being different from the rest of the UFO groups, and that they want to keep their UFO influence secret. They really aren't happy that the big UFO element to Scientology sort of gotten out. I wanted to ask you just to elaborate a little bit on that, why you think they want to maintain the UFO influence as a secret within their group when it seems like all the other groups sort of use that as the main thrust of their whole movement.
Well, I suspect that, you know, in the end, we might look back and say it's a cunning move on the part of Scientology. That if their goal was to get their message out and to attract lots of people to accept their faith, then what they've done by keeping it quiet has been a good thing. I mean, if your goal is to spread the truth so that everybody hears your message, that's one thing. If your goal is to induct people into your religious movement and make devoted followers out of them, then it makes an awful lot of sense to keep these things secret. The average person on the street who hears the story of Xenu and the body thetans and the entire intergalactic background to Scientology is going to just reject it outright upon hearing that. Mm-hmm. However, if you have someone who has already been sort of brought into the movement through less outrageous claims, and they've already invested in it, both their time and their finances and their emotions, then they might be far more likely to accept a rather strange claim.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be working. They may not be the largest religious community in the world. They are certainly have very dedicated members and very powerful members, and have a lot of influence in culture.
Yeah.
So I suspect that's what's going on. It also, of course, plays into a theme that's common in many religions, dating back to the old Greco-Roman mystery cults. And there's something unique about having a mystery revealed to you only after you've reached a certain level of experience and devotion. Mm-hmm. It seems to make the message more important if you have to work to get it or pay to get it, than if you're just giving it away. And I think by making people work and pay for it, Scientology is quite successful. It's out now, though. I don't know what tactic they're going to be raising in the future. I know that when I was researching the book, I would always find what were supposedly handwritten notes by L. Ron Hubbard about some of the doctrines of Scientology. And I would find those on the net, and then within 24, 36 hours, they'd be gone.
Oh, wow.
Taken off the net. And then they'd come back again at a different site. Mm-hmm. And so I get the feeling that they are actively policing the information, even though I think South Park and other venues have shared the idea with the world. I think they're still actively trying to keep it under wraps. It was kind of interesting to keep tracking down the documents. There are obviously some people who want the message to get out, probably people who are former members or who are very critical of the movement.
Yeah, because I just saw yesterday or a few days ago some new article about Tom Cruise building a bunker to protect from alien attacks or something like that. So it sounds like this is an ongoing thing with Scientology now, where the UFO element's really getting exposed.
Right, and I expect that will continue. Whether or not that's going to hurt them or help them, I don't know. I don't think the UFO element is as persuasive in popular culture now as it might have been 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. In other words, I don't know that it's as appealing. At least that's what my editor tells me, that people aren't buying the books like they were back in the early to mid 90s.
Yeah,
that there's a drop off in the sales of UFO books. So does this mean that Scientology picked a bad time to reveal their extraterrestrial heritage? I don't know. We'll wait and see. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. Is there any sort of theme to all these groups in the sense of their evolution? Do they follow any sort of pattern as far as, starts out, it gets bigger, and then all of a sudden people sort of die out when prophecies aren't fulfilled, or the leader does something where they become not as believed in as much anymore?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. That I mean, we do see a pattern in many of these UFO religious movements in which they depend very much on the persuasiveness and the charisma of their founding member. And when their founding member either, ends up doing something wrong or dies, then it's often hard for the group to maintain itself. One good example of the importance of charisma, I think, is the Unarians out in San Diego. Mm-hmm. In that, when they were first founded, they grew rather slowly. It wasn't until I'm drawing a blank on the name, I'm afraid, but it wasn't until the spouse of their founder grew to prominence in the movement that they began to take off and gather a great deal of steam, simply because she was quite charismatic. Yeah. Upon her death, however, the group split into factions and has continued to drop off in size. So you can really track it with that. Here you have a movement starts off on a shaky foundation. They find a charismatic leader and they grow rather quickly, and then when the leader dies, things drop off. It also hurt them very much, I think, that they made predictions about extraterrestrial craft landing on the Earth in the later part of the 20th century. Obviously, I mean, that didn't happen, and their explanation that they didn't come because we humans aren't yet ready, I don't think was a satisfactory explanation to a lot of people. Yeah. And so there you have the death of a leader combined with a failed prophecy, and you see these things begin to dwindle away. I don't think it has to be like that, though, and one of the problems now is that it's just too soon, even though it's been 50 years, 60 years since the modern flying saucer phenomenon began. It's still too soon to see whether or not any of these movements are going to really have a lasting influence and be around for a long time. Yeah. I think one of the, if not the earliest, probably the earliest religion to have clear connections with the idea of extraterrestrial life would be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Mm-hmm. And there you see a movement that's began with a very charismatic leader. The leader died. They faced many crises, but as I understand it now, they're one of the fastest growing sects in America today. So there you clearly see a group that's managed to keep on going. Though I have to say they are doing an even better job than Scientology, I suppose, of keeping the extraterrestrial elements of their religion under wraps. That they don't present that in a public forum very much at all. Yeah. So that here you have what I would classify as a UFO religion, but everybody within that movement, I think, would deny my claim that that's what they are. But they're doing well.
Yeah. Just to sort of leap to the third part of the book with the ancient astronauts and that sort of discussion, I guess the first thing I want to ask you about is you point out a really interesting paradox that exists in the ancient astronaut theory, and that is respecting the ancient culture and saying, we have to believe their myths and legends and that they were true and that we have to, take what they write as face value, versus the idea that they would have needed help, that they were a primitive people who needed outside help to achieve, their great monuments and things like that. Talk a little bit about that sort of paradox that exists in the ancient astronaut school of thought.
Sure. I think basic to the claim of the ancient astronaut theory, which is that the origins of human culture and the ancient monuments and ancient civilizations are the result of extraterrestrials visiting the Earth and assisting with the foundation of society and the foundation of culture. Coupled with the belief that the truths of this extraterrestrial encounter are found within the sacred doctrines, the sacred writings and mythologies of ancient peoples. So that when the Hebrew Bible talks about the Nephilim, the giants in the earth who are the descendants of fallen angels or sons of God who have cohabited with human women, what's really being said there, according to the ancient astronaut hypothesis, is that these sons of God were really astronauts from another world who came here and produced children with earth women, and they were the giants, famous, influential people of ancient days. And so what's the interesting paradox that you bring out there is that the ancient astronaut theory depends on the assumption that the ancient people are both more backwards than mainstream history tells us, and also that they are more advanced than mainstream history tells us. They're more advanced because while we regard their ancient writings as kind of interesting mythology and fairy tales, they are really recording historical facts and scientific truths, some of which are even beyond modern humanity at this point in our development. On the other hand, the ancient astronaut theory says that the ancient peoples were far more primitive than mainstream history tells us because they could not have been responsible for the monuments like the Great Pyramid, that they could not have been responsible for even knowing the things that are revealed in their scriptures and in their writings, that this information, that civilization itself could not have come from primitive humans. It had to come from somewhere else. And if you are a nuts and bolts person who doesn't believe in gods and angels so much, then you could posit that extraterrestrials came down and brought those things to the world and were mistaken for gods. So I find that interesting that the ancient astronaut movement sort of gives credit to the ancients by saying they were really quite brilliant and recorded the truth of extraterrestrial visits, and at the same time they were so primitive that they couldn't have possibly built the things and achieved the things that history tells us were achieved by them. I don't know what that dichotomy is about, except it's clearly an approach to the strangeness that one encounters when one encounters an ancient culture. I mean, there's something akin to encountering an extraterrestrial when you visit ancient monuments from a people about whom we know very little.
Yeah.
Why did they build Stonehenge? What could their purpose have possibly been? Why did they build the Great Pyramid? What possible purpose could this have? This seems, by our standards, a waste of manpower, a waste of resources with their limited technology for them to have done this. What's the mystery of their life, their form of life, that would explain this? And there's something about it that's so far away from who we are that it seems sometimes easier to say it's alien than it's just another form of being human.
Yeah.
That humans can be this complex, even without the technology, that there's something basically complex about Homo sapiens, even in their earliest historical incarnations. And so both facets of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, these people were brilliant, and these people were so backwards they couldn't have built the things we see that they built. Both of those are responses to this alienness of different people from so very long ago.
And you see that almost in the modern times, too, because a lot of things that are on the peripheral of the UFO phenomenon, like cattle mutilation and crop circles, those things really quickly get lumped in with UFOs, because UFOs seems to be like the catch-all for anything that's strange.
Exactly. In that sense, flying saucers, archaic term, but I prefer it, I think. Flying saucers are the mystical metaphor of the 20th century, the late 20th century. Mm-hmm. And so that much of our mysteries get thrown into that pot. Charles Fort wouldn't have done that because, and Fort, even though he has some sort of extraterrestrial hypotheses here and there, Fort kind of relishes the diversity of the mystery.
Yeah.
And he had no overarching schema which everything would be lumped under for him. But I think we have that now, and I think that's the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that everything from Bigfoot to cattle mutilations has an extraterrestrial explanation.
Yeah, exactly. From a religious perspective, do you think that that it's the sort of situation where, with the influx of science and this sort of science versus religion thing, that UFOs takes like the form of science in a way, as a way to counteract the God situation? You know what I mean? Where in the sense that, like, there's lights in the sky, maybe a long time ago, they would have said, that's a sign from God, But now there's sort of an anti-godness going on in society in the form of how science is sort of its own sort of religion, and that ufology is a way to sort of add on to that and be the counterbalance to the God theory. Do you follow what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, the psychologist Carl Jung made this kind of assessment 50 years ago when he said that UFOs are modern day scientific angels. That's the role they're playing. I mean, regardless of what they are they extraterrestrials? Are they mystical beings from another dimension? Are they simply figments of mass psychosis? Who knows? But Jung said, whatever they are, the role they play in our society is akin to the role of angels and spiritual beings and gods. But they're scientific angels. Right? They are advanced civilizations. They're not deities from heaven. They are, in the final analysis, they're beings like us, flesh and blood, whatever color that might be. So you're exactly right. They play the role of gods and deities, but without the supernatural element that's necessary for those things. So that as our world becomes more and more secular, though I suppose it will continue to have the kind of religious yearnings and the need for meaning and understanding that humans always have had. But as we become more secular in our understanding of the cosmos, it only makes sense that we would find our gods in metal ships rather than in flaming chariots.
And that's one of the things you also sort of point out in the paradox of ufology is the belief in science, that even though UFOs don't fit into the scientific world, the nuts and bolts ufologists have sort of like a diehard belief in science, that that's the way to answer the question. How science sort of has become its own religion in a sense, kind of how I alluded to earlier. And there's this sort of paradox in ufology with this hardcore belief in science and using science to prove ufology, and that science is, is the reasoning behind UFOs, versus the fact that science doesn't really want anything to do with UFOs, and ufology is kind of ignored by science. If the theories behind the nuts and bolts ufologists, as far as the extraterrestrial hypothesis go, they're going to have to change science fundamentally if it's proven that, there's ETs flying around in metal ships. So there's sort of a paradox there of belief in science versus trying to change science. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And this is the struggle that any, outsider group within the scientific establishment faces. They're trying to bring about, hoping to bring about what the philosopher Thomas Kuhn called, and the term's been overused, but what he called a paradigm shift. They're trying to shift science from viewing things this way so that science views things another way, still relying on the empirical evidences of science. And I mean, finally, though, in my perspective, I have to say, I continually see the science of ufology coming up short. Mm-hmm. That the science just isn't there. Will it be there? Perhaps. I don't think that the scientific establishment is turning its back on good, solid evidence at this point. I don't think there is good, solid evidence at this point. That doesn't mean I don't think good, solid evidence might be discovered if we keep on looking for it, but it's not there yet. But it puts nuts and bolts ufology in a bind. How can they remain convinced that that the explanation for this is scientific when science itself refuses to accept their version of the facts? And I'm afraid it's disintegrated into name calling on both sides a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And that ufologists, claim that mainstream science is just refusing to look at the evidence, and mainstream science calls ufologists, all kinds of bad names. And in the realm of science as it should be, there's no reason that ufology shouldn't go on and continue researching this problem in scientific terms. But they shouldn't expect the scientific community to accept all of their conclusions just yet.
Yeah.
Because I don't think there's enough evidence just yet. There's a friendlier way to go about this. But I think probably the conflict says a lot about how uneasy the relationship will be, however. Because despite the fact that ufology wants to be scientific, as long as it places such an incredible amount of weight on eyewitness testimonies, I think it will continue to be ignored by mainstream science. That there's just, eyewitness testimony just isn't going to be the thing that wins the case for ufology.
Yeah.
They're going to have nuts and bolts. Sooner or later, there's going to have to be something. Like
exactly.
In the Bigfoot community, which I'm researching at the moment, there's this constant debate about what do? Do we need a body or not? Yes, you need a body, or you need part of a body, or you're never going to have proof, because in the final analysis, the difference between the panda, the giant panda, which was thought to be a mythical creature for many years, the difference between that and a Sasquatch is that we have specimens of one and not the other. And the eyewitness testimony will never tip the scales until you have that hard evidence.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I find so compelling about the contactee movement and the lunatic fringe is that, okay, maybe this is nuts and bolts, and maybe this is a physical thing that we're talking about here. Maybe we can achieve awareness of extraterrestrials through scientific research. But the quest to do so might make us miss something else that's important in the story. We might miss the spiritual truths in our quest for the factual truth.
Yeah.
We might miss something. Nuts and bolts ufology finds itself in the middle between the lunatic fringe and the mainstream scientists, and being pulled in both directions. And I don't know. We'll see how. So far, it tends to still want to, put its fortunes with mainstream science rather than the lunatic fringe. But we'll see if that continues.
Yeah. And then one of the big points you make in the book is that you see fear as a driving force behind ufology, fear of all sorts of things, fear of the government, fear of the unknown, fear of ourselves. Talk a little bit about fear as the driving force behind ufology, because I found that to be one of the big themes of the book.
You can go back as far as the 1950s, in which one of the things I say is that I don't think a lot of the early contactee movement, the early sightings, were fear driven in quite the way they might become later. But we certainly have in the 1950s and 60s these Hollywood movies which use flying saucers to represent our fear of, I suppose, of the Soviet Union and our fears of forces beyond our control at the heart of the Cold War. But it didn't end there. It didn't end with the end of the Cold War. And just as I said a few minutes ago, I believe many of our classical religious hopes and intuitions are being placed on the backs of, lights in the night sky. I think also a lot of basic human fears have become substantiated in the form of extraterrestrials and flying saucers. In simple ways, like, walking in the woods at night. It's natural for human beings to be a little bit scared of that kind of situation. Something about our biology, I suspect, that heightens our awareness, pumps a little adrenaline in our system when we find ourselves in a dark forest far away from other people. In this day and age, those kinds of fears are instantiated in the forms of seeing flying saucers and experiencing extraterrestrial phenomena. But it goes deeper than that basic, that kind of basic human fear. I also think, that ufology sometimes begins to take on our fear of in general, our fear of the other. It's not an accident, I think, that we call these creatures in spacecraft aliens.
Yeah.
Just as we call, the influx of people from other countries that so many people in our culture today are afraid of, aliens. I mean, it's this basic fear of otherness, of people and things that are different from us, and it can take on terrifying forms. So that our fear of strangeness symbolically is incarnated in the form of creatures from outer space. A fear of our government, which we probably have a good reason to be afraid of. Fear of our government takes on the form of fear of their relationship with extraterrestrials. fear of things we don't understand, fear of the mysteries of life, takes on a form of fear of extraterrestrial entities.
Yeah.
Fear of sexual abuse, fear of life's tragedies is displayed in the abductee movement. Now, that's not to say that all of these movements are, and all of these expressions of ufology are nothing more than reflections of our human fears. I'm not making a psychological argument to try to explain these things away. I'm just saying that these are the reasons that these UFO experiences resonate with us in such a way as they do. We're no longer afraid of the devil. Many people aren't anyways.
Mm-hmm.
What are we afraid of? We're afraid of beings from another world.
Yeah.
We're afraid of that light in the sky. There's some bad things about that. I mean, I think it's bad when we become so frozen by our fear, as I criticize the abductee movement of encouraging us to be so frozen by our fear that we can't do anything about the problems that we face. But it's also good that the sense of awe, the sense of what the philosopher Rudolf Otto used to call holy terror.
Yeah.
A sense of holy terror in a basic human sense, I suppose. And extraterrestrials and flying saucers make an easy place for us to place those fears.
Yeah.
We should be careful, though, because, I mean, if we do that too readily, we may miss out on what's really there. We may only see the thing that we're afraid of, just like if we only, see the invading armada of Hispanic-speaking people as something to be afraid of. We might miss the wonderful, kind people that are moving in down the street from us.
Yeah, exactly. As a student of religion, what do you make of some of the mainstream religions' takes on the UFO phenomenon? Now, I know the Catholic religion they've got the observatory, and a lot of people in the UFO world sort of want to ascribe a UFO-related elements to the Vatican observatory, and I know that I don't know how recently it was, but in the last 2 or 3 years, they came out with some kind of statement that was like UFOs and ETs would not change the perspective of the church or something like that. So what's your take on mainstream religion acknowledging the UFO phenomenon and their perspective on it?
Well, a few years ago when a meteorite was found with what might be regarded as evidence of life having existed on Mars at one point, the press immediately wanted to talk to church leaders about, what are the implications of this for your faith? Doesn't this challenge your faith? And I've never really understood that argument, and having talked with lots of Christian people and religious people about the subject, I don't find that it's not something that is a direct threat or challenge to most people's core Christian values. What I do see, though, is this, particularly among more evangelical Christian churches, there is a growing or continuing distrust of UFO religious movements and UFO beliefs as they lump that together with the New Age phenomena, and they regard it as satanic forces, idolatry, and they would say that anyone who claims to have had these kinds of experiences was really being deceived by the devil or something like that. And it's just sort of this, I guess it's nothing more than petty feuding between, religious sects. It's, well, your God is really the devil kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's most interesting is what I've encountered among many mainstream Christian believers, and that is I've met a lot of people who, go to church on Sunday, but they've seen those lights, or they've had the abduction experience. And I don't see a lot of people weaving those things together too clearly at this point, but I suspect it's going to happen. I hope it happens, because I like syncretism when it comes to religion. I like it when things gets all blended up together. I find that extremely interesting.
Yeah.
And I think it's very healthy for a society. So I think that's beginning to happen, is that people will go to church on Sunday, and on Saturday nights they'll go to a meeting of their local UFO society and don't really see any discrepancy between those things. And I think that's where the future is in terms of extraterrestrials and religion. Official religion will continue to frown on UFO cults. Evangelicals will continue to frown on the UFO movement in general, but the average American Joe Sixpack is probably going to find some way to handle both and believe in both.
Yeah. The sort of conclusion in the book is about new gods and how the UFOs and ETs are sort of like the new gods, but they end up being just like the old gods. I guess just talk a little bit about that religious aspect to the ET UFO phenomenon.
Sure, yeah. At the end of the book, I tried to express some of my own feelings about the whole thing. I've done that throughout to some extent, but just wanted to try to bring it all together in a few pages. And one of the things that strikes me as most important is that if we begin to think about the UFO phenomena as a religious movement, you see there's a contrast between the gods of ufology and the gods of traditional religion. And I find this most in the contactees of the 1950s. If I had to pick out a group in the UFO community that I'm most enthralled with and most interested in, it would be George Adamski and all of those who came after him. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find most refreshing and intriguing about them is that their gods, in the sense, lowercase g, their gods, their angels, are visitors from Venus, visitors from the planet Clarion, and they are very much like us. They dress in fashionable clothes. They use, in terms of visitors from the planet Clarion, they speak in human slang right out of the 1950s. They make mistakes. They have human emotions. Yeah. They dance. They go to cocktail parties. They're very much like us, and yet they're more than we are because they have achieved both technological advancement and ethical, spiritual advancement. They've managed to make themselves better in conjunction with making their technology better. And that, to me, I call that image the image of the new gods. Mm-hmm. That for a short while there were a group of people who were saying, look, we can make ourselves better, and as we make our technology better, so that we can make the world better. Yeah. And they really believed that. And because these gods were in strictly human form, they lacked all the things that gods are supposed to have, like omniscience and omnipotence. Mm-hmm. That they couldn't lay down, the answer to everything, because even the gods of Adamski didn't have the answer to everything. Even they faced the mystery of reality. And something of a romantic, I suppose. I find all that very compelling. And so I suggest that for a moment there was a chance that these new gods were being born. I don't think it lasted, though, because the new gods soon in culture took on the qualities of the old gods, so that you have in, say, the movement in Georgia known as the Yamasee Indians, who have claimed extraterrestrial source as their source for being on this earth. You have what's to me a very frightening image of extraterrestrials as kind of a predator species, destroying power, which lays down very strict laws for behavior, and who have achieved a kind of perfectness of power and morality that we humans would never achieve. So the new gods have just become the old gods all over again in that sense. That we no longer, I guess it is that we no longer believe that we can improve our ethics as we improve our technology and together make something incredible happen. I think now we are perhaps so frightened of our technology and so down and so negative about human potential that we've gone back, and in ufology and in the religious circles within ufology, gone back to looking for the old omniscient, omnipowerful God, omnipotent God of the past. We've given up the new gods of Adamski and substituted them with the old gods from outer space instead. But I like the old days in that sense. I wish we could have those new gods back again. I wish we could find a way in our society to believe in human progress that is moral as well as technological, and not only believe in it but make it happen.
Yeah,
that would be a wonderful thing.
And then the only last question I have for you is sort of a big picture thing with ufology, and just what your thoughts are on the landscape of modern ufology, and especially with regards to this exopolitical sort of aspect. You didn't really mention the exopolitics in the book, but that's sort of like the big new movement. It's not so much a religion in a sense, but its own little culture pushing like political activism and that kind of thing. And they're at odds with the nuts and bolts guys. They're kind of almost stepping into the realm of the antithesis to the nuts and bolts people now, as like we said, the contactees, that doesn't seem to be happening as much anymore. Now there's this exopolitics that's butting up against ufology, but that's more of a belief structure in activism, that kind of thing, versus science. Do you have any thoughts on that whole thing, and have you looked at it at all?
Well, I have looked at it, and I imagine that I'm going to do more coverage of that in the next edition. But as it continues to grow and develop, and to probably take on more religious connotations here and there. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and a lot of that rises, of course, out of the ancient astronaut theories and out of the contactee movements themselves. So that you have, the idea of the Ashtar Command and this sort of interstellar government, which calls upon the individuals on the Earth to participate in certain ethical actions in order to bring about a better world, so that we can be finally united with the Federation. So I don't know that it's all that new in that sense, right? Because it's rooted in those ideas of sacrifice and service to the planet, to humanity, to the larger picture, which was part and parcel of what at least some of the old contactees had to say. Now, I think it's all connected now, and it's been touched and transformed by conspiracy theorists and a lot of the ideas that one finds there. But you put those things together, the contactee movement combined with the conspiracy theorists, and you begin to get the foundations of the kind of thing that you're talking about. But I suspect it's going to continue to play out. I mean, this is how it happens in the early days of any, not only of any religious movement, but of any cultural movement, in that you have, in these early days, even 60 years after, you have, battles between the groups. Will one finally, win out as the voice of belief in extraterrestrials? Well, assuming that we don't have, an extraterrestrial landing on the White House lawn, so that all the questions are answered, yes, I think, assuming that doesn't happen, then yes, I think we'll continue to have, hopefully, a very vibrant conversation between the different groups. I mean, it was 300 years after the birth of Christianity, before the Christian Bible was codified and agreed upon. Those weren't 300 peaceful years. Those were 300 years of inner battles and struggling with one another and arguing about what was important, until finally there was some consensus that arose. And I suspect something like that is going to happen here. Of course, that's barring, as I said, UFOs on the White House lawn, which would probably put an end to a lot of the fighting and show us what's real. But no one, I don't think anymore, is expecting that, which is kind of odd, I suppose, that in 1954, a lot of people were expecting it. 50 years later, I don't know that anyone wakes up thinking today might be the day when they make contact. I mean, everybody's had to sort of change their way of looking at it to account for the fact that 60 years have passed since we first got interested in this, and the big moment hasn't yet arrived.
Yeah.
Maybe there is no big moment. Maybe there's only the small moments, the personal encounters, the ethics, the religion. Maybe that's what there will be. That finally became, of course, true of Christianity too. It was only after that expectation of the second coming of Christ began to waver after 300 years and there was no return. It was only then that a deeper, more spiritual element of Christianity began to prosper and bloom.
Huh. So you think that maybe the spiritual element of ufology will take hold more as time goes by and we never get any solid answers and we don't get the literal nuts and bolts, then maybe more of a spiritual element will come about from it.
If we don't get the nuts and bolts sooner or later, I mean, I can't think of any other way.
Yeah.
I think belief in extraterrestrials will continue. But if we don't get the evidence, convincing evidence, then the people will continue to believe. They'll just find different ways to talk about it.
Huh. All right. So what's coming up next for you? What's on the horizon for Greg Reece? You said you were doing some Bigfoot research, so maybe that might be it. But you'll let us know what's going on for you coming up.
Sure. Yeah. Right now, I'm working on completing a book which should be out probably about this time next year, tentatively titled "Weird Science and Bizarre Beliefs," and it will follow the pattern of UFO religion, and then I'm going to try once again to be an observer of people who hold beliefs that are different from mine and try to appreciate and respect them. And I'm looking at a broader spectrum this time. I'm looking at the world of cryptozoology, a lot of emphasis on the Sasquatch mystery. I'm also looking at advanced technology, amazing inventions, looking at the world around the idea of ancient technology as well as Tesla technology. And in the third section of the book, we'll be looking at lost civilizations. Both I'll be talking a little about Atlantis and the idea of the ancient civilization, and also the Hollow Earth theory, both the Hollow Earth theory and the Shaver mystery, caverns under the ground theory. So I've had done a lot of fun research, both reading and meeting people. Been out on a Bigfoot hunt already, and it's been a lot of fun, and I think the book's going to be a great deal of fun too.
Awesome. And that's sometime around this time next year, you say?
Yes, I think so.
All right, well, Greg, thank you so much for coming on the show. The book is UFO Religion, Inside Flying Saucer Cults and Culture, and the website, UFOReligion.com. People can get it just about anywhere, I presume. I found it at my local Barnes & Noble, so it's got good distribution. Definitely worth picking up. Very fascinating look at all the different groups that have sort of sprung up over the years and staked their claim to the UFO situation and what happened with those groups, how they came about, where they went and all that great stuff. It's a very thorough read and very well researched, so it was great to have him on the show and talk to him. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Greg.
Thanks. It's been a lot of fun.
That does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio Season 3. Big thanks to Greg Reece for coming on the show. You can find out more information on Greg and his book at www.uforeligion.com. Check it out. We're going to skip over BOA Audio listener feedback for one more week, and I guarantee, folks, it's coming back next week on the program. So, if you want to get your emails in line to be a part of this exciting segment, here's how you do it. Simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com or go to binnallofamerica.com and click the contact button on the left-hand side of the screen. Either one of those methods puts your correspondence into the BOA Audio listener feedback mailbag. Time now, of course, to thank the fantastic binnallofamerica.com staff for your help and support with the audio series and the website. Leslie, Chiron, Arlie, Joe V, and Tina Senna. Week in and week out, the BOA staff is producing tremendous reading material that you can find at binnallofamerica.com. Over the last couple of weeks, Leslie has been covering the Dennis Kucinich UFO story from a number of different angles. And this past week, Chiron posted a fantastic review of the new Alex Jones film, Endgame. So as you can see, there's tons of stuff to be found at binnallofamerica.com, aside from the podcast you're listening to right now. As we've been known to say here at the end of the program, if you're only listening to BOA Audio and you're not reading the columns at binnallofamerica.com, you're only getting half the story. If you're a long-time BOA Audio listener or an appreciative newcomer, and you want to help support the audio series and the website, there's a way you can do that. Simply go to binnallofamerica.com or the BOA Audio archive page, click the golden PayPal button, and make a donation. No donation is too small, and all donations go towards helping keep the audio series and the website up and running, advertisement-free, and freely available for all of our great listeners and readers the world over. So, go to BOA, click the PayPal button, and make a donation. It would be greatly appreciated. As we teased at the end of the program last week, I know some folks have a hard time making a donation for something that they're already getting for free. I think there's some kind of psychological issue there. I'm not sure what it is, but I can understand it, identify with that sort of thing. So, as a result, binnallofamerica.com is on the verge of rolling out a new line of merchandise. This isn't going to be the old-style BOA merchandise. We're going to go in a whole new direction here, folks, and you are going to flip your wig when you see this stuff. The project is already underway. I'm already looking over drafts for this new merchandise, and the feedback I've been getting from the staff of BOA is very promising. I think these are going to be a huge hit, and I'm looking forward to seeing the reaction from the BOA audio listeners when they see this new merchandise. The BOA line will be available soon, probably within the next couple of weeks, and when that rolls out, hopefully you'll pick up some merchandise, and in turn, that'll throw a little change into our coffers here at binnallofamerica.com and will help keep the podcast series from being cost prohibitive. So stay tuned to binnallofamerica.com for the soon-to-be-unveiled BOA line of merchandise. Next week on the program, it is a very special edition of BOA Audio. It's a theme episode of sorts. It's the Mass UFO Show / Mass Monster Mash special. And what's that all about, my friends? What that's about is on-site interviews from the big esoteric double bill that I attended in early October. It's going to be featuring 6 great esoteric researchers talking about a variety of different subjects. Let me give you a rundown on who's going to be on the program next week and what they're going to be talking about. Lauren Coleman will be covering the Dover Demon, Bridgewater Triangle, and the Virginia Tech shootings. Chris Balzano, an up-and-coming researcher who I'm predicting will be one of the breakout stars in esoterica in 2008, will be discussing his work exploring Massachusetts paranormal folklore and phantom clowns. Don Keating will tell us about the White Bigfoot and the Ohio cryptozoology scene. Carl Feint will detail his work looking at USOs, unidentified submerged objects. Don Ecker will tell us about his research into black triangles and Shag Harbor, and former BOA audio guest Chris Stiles will give us an update on what he's been up to since his appearance last spring, and his thoughts on being so closely associated with one specific UFO case, that being Shag Harbor. It's the closest you can get to being there, as BOA Audio brings you this fantastic mix of esoteric audio taped on location at the Mass UFO Show / Mass Monster Mash next week on BOA Audio Season 3. And on that note, there's not much left to say, my friends. Until next week, this is Tim Binnall, thanking you for listening and signing off.